What up, friends? It's Temporary, and today we're going to be reviewing AWOLNATION's newest album, The Phantom 5. This is the fifth studio album by American rock and electronic band AWOLNATION. You might remember that they broke into the scene with their 2011 smash hit Sail, which honestly feels like an entire lifetime ago. Their first two albums especially were weird. I actually really like them, but they were just doing so many things all at once on these records that it's honestly kind of hard to classify what exactly the genre of those things were. However, they definitely mainly focused on the electronic instrumentals on those two, much to the satisfaction of my ADHD. After that though, the group definitely honed in on the more rock side that they were experimenting with on those records with their third album, Here Come the Runs, and that was honestly a pretty solid album in its own right as well. However, they followed this up with Angel Miners and the Lightning Riders, and while I did review it fairly positively on my channel, I haven't really gone back to it since. I probably wouldn't rate it as highly today. This newest album largely follows in that album's footsteps, kind of trying to find the middle ground between their electronic and rock styles that they've experimented with in the past. Unfortunately, this album honestly has even less of a vision than that one did. I just really don't know what the fuck they were aiming for here. The album leads with Jump Sit Stand March, one of the better songs on the project and a bit more reminiscent of those earlier records. The hazy guitars and hypnotic piano definitely create a very despondent vibe, and it also has a tinge of rage in it as well that I think is pretty appreciated on this one. This is especially because the lighter vocals from Aaron alongside the harsher vocals by guest vocalist Emily Armstrong create a nice dichotomy. It has this sort of two sides of the same mind feeling to it. This also fits with the lyrics too, describing how overstimulating the modern world is and how a lot of world leaders seem to have left the little guys behind in their quest for power. Though, I will say that Emily Armstrong's questionable past with Scientology do make these lyrics a bit interesting, I will say that. However, they're vague enough to where it doesn't go totally into conspiratorial territory and, whack job scenes. And, she has distanced herself from the church apparently, so, I think this one's okay. And for what it is, it's pretty fun to listen to. The next track, Party People, doesn't really hit the same though. It does have a fairly interesting sound with its driving beat and acoustic guitar flourishes, but other than that, it's just a very straightforward song overall. It's a bit plain overall, however I do think the chorus has a nice swell of the beat, guitar, and fuzzy bass elements. However, I do have to say that lyrically, it's pretty repetitive, unfortunately. It actually kind of embodies the record, if we're being real here. There's some pretty interesting stuff that's going on every so often, but everything that surrounds it is just kind of doing the bare minimum. The rest of the lyrics, in addition to being repetitive, also don't even really say all that much, which is kind of another blow to this song. It's pretty catchy, I will say that, and there's nothing egregiously wrong with it, but again, it's just kind of there. Panoramic View is definitely a bit better though, having a very delicate yet dramatic flair to it that I think is very reminiscent of some of the ballad-oriented songs on Megalithic Symphony. The flow of the track, created by the light guitar, synths, and very rhythmic drums, also help create a cool vibe to this one, and I also think this sort of lullaby angle that they're going for is also fairly compelling in comparison to a lot of the other songs on here. In a way, it almost sounds like Aaron is talking to a child and telling them to keep their hope alive in this tumultuous world. He might even be talking to his childhood self, if we're being honest here. The lyrics are still a bit repetitive, but they do fit this song better than the previous one, adding to the sway and delicate nature to the track overall. I Am Happy is one of those ones where I don't know if I like it or I dislike it, but it is definitely the most interesting song on the album, or at least one of them. It almost has a Demon Days era Gorillaz feel to it, which is absolutely thanks to the very heavy bass focus that this track has, in addition to fucking Del the Funky Homo Sapien here, bro. The chorus also has the classic Damon Albarn weirdness in the vocals going on right here, and that in addition to Del's very bouncy flow, it actually works surprisingly well. The lyrics are also all about, you guessed it, being happy and not letting the world beat the hope out of you, which I think actually fits this weird yet triumphant instrumental. I've come around. I think I actually really like this one. Barbarian is another one that's not bad per se, but it's also just not really doing anything for me. It's vocally okay, you know, but it just doesn't have that classic AWOL Nation weirdness. It just kind of feels like your average generic alt-rock or pop-rock song. It's serviceable, but in a way it sounds weirdly dated and uninteresting because of that. Bang Your Head honestly feels a bit more interesting in concept rather than execution. Judging by the Super Bowl mention in the lyrics, this song seems to be about how a lot of like sports stars and, you know, especially NFL stars in this instance, are unwilling to actually take a stand against injustice and instead just toe the line by playing the game where they just bash into each other. It's almost like Aaron is saying that they just are unable to think of anything more complex than that. He could also be drawing parallels to the NFL's sketchy history when it comes to things like this. You know, we can also look back at their response to people taking a knee during the BLM movements and things like that. Because of this, I actually do think the harder rock sound of this track fits this sort of lyrical theme, but I feel like there was a bit more of an interesting way to actually tell it. It was an interesting concept, and I do like the direct references to things like the Super Bowl, but this is also a topic that I think requires a lot of like nuance, but also a lot of like explanations on like how things ended up the way that they are, and this song is just a bit too simplistic to fully capture all of that. You know, it's a complex topic. I feel like we could have used a bit more in the lyrics to actually give it the full detail that it deserves. City of Nowhere is basically a glorified intermission. It certainly exists, and it's honestly too short to even say that, oh, it could have done something interesting if we made it a full track. I don't even know if I got that much out of it, to be honest. A Letter to No One is probably the last notable song on this record for me, having a very dire and dramatic guitar-driven instrumental. I say dramatic, but it's done in a very low-key way too, which I think is pretty engaging. The subtle additions of funky bass tones and synths add a lot to the song's personality, and I think it helps really capture the gloominess that Aaron is talking about in the lyrics here. The lyrics are actually kind of all over the place, but in a way I think this also fits as a sort of like diary entry of Aaron just scribbling down thoughts as they come to him, especially when he talks about, you know, gloomy weather and how he prefers it. And then we also have things like how his friends have pretty much all passed at this point, and even how, you know, a lot of advice that come from the older generations just isn't really applicable to modern life anymore, and it doesn't really help a lot of the younger generations. It's almost like melancholic rambling, but I think it really works, especially as, you know, like the first song on the record states, everybody feels very overstimulated and worn down about how they've been exploited by, you know, huge corporations, governments, you name it. Unfortunately, I don't really have that much to say about When I Was Young either. It's not bad, but again, it feels fairly generic. It kind of has this modern Pet Shop Boys sound to it, which is pretty different for the project, I guess, but nothing on here really grabs me. The lyrics see Aaron recalling his youth, but they don't really have enough detail to keep me fully invested in this one. The dancey synths, guitar, and beat definitely do their job, but not much more than that. The album ends with Outta Here, a fairly low-key and mystical sounding ballad. It's not really the most impactful end, but again, it's not terrible. I think the biggest problem that I have with this one is that the track gets less interesting when it gets into the more rock-sounding instrumental as the chorus comes around. I thought the sort of haunting and foreboding vibe that was established during the verses was when the song was at its most interesting. It also has a problem of feeling fairly repetitive lyrically as well, and it doesn't really do much that actually makes it feel like a last hurrah of the record. The bridge is pretty nice as it emphasizes the bittersweet tone of the lyrics, but, you know, I feel like all in all, this song kind of just fizzles out, and unfortunately that's kind of the note that the album ends on. Unfortunately, this album didn't do much for me. It wasn't bad per se, and you know, while I am used to AWOL's projects being fairly messy and they're kind of just throwing everything at you, they at least had like a vision to them, you know? Megalithic Symphony and Run felt very fresh and like the band was having fun just throwing a bunch of sounds at the wall and seeing what stuck. Here Come the Runs is definitely their most concise project, and while the hard rock instrumental stylings were a little less interesting compared to the electronic stuff that they were doing before, it definitely felt like it had a concrete sound and message to get across. This album, on the other hand, has that messy vibe of the first two, but it doesn't have the songwriting and experimentation to back it up. There are moments of this experimentation, like like on Jump Sit Stand March and I Am Happy, and also some of the more emotional moments as well, like on A Letter to No One, but these moments are kind of few and far between. In a weird way, this album feels kind of rushed. The repetitive lyrics and more straightforward songs like Bang Your Head and City of Nowhere are very noticeable, and I'm just not really used to an album from AWOLNATION feeling so simple. It's very basic and by the numbers, especially compared to their first two albums. Like I said in the review, it actually sounds a bit dated here and there, like it's stuck in the early 2010s. It still does its job even if it is by the numbers, but it is fairly disappointing compared to the off-the-wall and eclectic stuff that I've come to expect from AWOLNATION. At the end of the day, I am feeling a decent 5 on the Phantom 5 by AWOLNATION. Of course, you still have to talk about album covers on this show, and this one's okay. I think the actual album cover is a bit more interesting than the record itself, to be honest. It also doesn't really have much to do with the sound all that much. You know, it does kind of relate to the more like gloomy and melancholic aesthetics of it, and also some of the eclectic weirdness of songs like I Am Happy. But on the whole, while I do think it's a fairly interesting cover, I don't think it really conveys a lot of what's on here. And if anything, actually gives a false expectation of the record. So, you know, composition-wise, I think it's pretty interesting. Color scheme-wise, it's fine. You know, it's an okay album cover, but I don't think it represents the album all that much. But of course, those are just my thoughts on this newest album by AWOLNATION. What did you guys think? Do you think this was actually a pretty interesting sidestep for them? Maybe a bit more engaging than their last few albums? Or are you kind of missing the off-the-wall weirdness of their first two? Let me know. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, and maybe you can be one of my phantoms. And until the next one, farewell.